There is a significant difference between being a Democrat and a Republican, especially for African Americans and other minority folks. I'm going to talk about the differences between Republican and Democrat, the philosophical differences between these two parties. But in order to get there, we got to look at a little history, and a little history of African Americans in this country. As we know, African Americans were enslaved by the record 1619, but we know probably before that, all the way up until the end of the Civil War. And it was the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution that ended these practices. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, the 13th. The 14th Amendment granted slaves citizenship. And the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was 1869, gave ex-slaves or ex-enslaved people the right to vote. These are the federal legislations that ended slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued, I think, in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, actually did not free any slaves. It was a proclamation that granted freedom to slaves in the rebellion Confederate States. However, the president had no authority to enforce that in these rebellious Confederate States. So it was an act that didn't have any effect until the Confederacy was defeated. In fact, there was borderline states on the border of the Confederacy and the Union that were slave states. And the Emancipation Proclamation did not free any slaves in those borderline states. And the 13th Amendment that ended slavery was passed at the end of the Civil War. Now, that being said, Emancipation Proclamation, done by Abraham Lincoln. Slaves at that time followed Lincoln, automatically became members of the Republican Party. The Republican Party was a party that was formed in 1854. And the basis of the Republican Party was opposition to slavery. The reason for the formation of the Republican Party was opposition to slavery. Now, purposes and initial programs and philosophies change over time. But it is ironic that Republicans today are so adamant against critical race theory that talks about American history and race being intertwined. And they adamantly against this and being taught in school, that they are members of a very party whose formation was based on the philosophy of opposition to slavery. And the most important early member of the Republican Party was Abraham Lincoln, who issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay. So blacks became adamant members and supporters of the Republican Party all the way up to 1936, when President Roosevelt put in place the New Deal. Blacks switched their loyalty to Democrats. Now, the South were Democrats. The segregationists were Democrats at that time. So the black vote from 1836 up to 1865, the majority of it was supporting Democrats because of the New Deal policies of FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So it's interesting that blacks were supporting Democrats who were the main party of the South and Southern segregationists, all the way up to 1865. So what changed things? The blacks didn't change their loyalty to the Democratic Party. In 1965, President Johnson went out, advocated, and passed the Voting Rights Act. And he knew when he passed the Voting Rights Act that the Southern Democrats will switch to Republican. Okay? And that's exactly what happens. And the South, even today, vote Republican from 1865. That's why the last election, presidential election, when Georgia went Democrat, was an amazing feat. It was the first Southern state to do that since 1965. All right? And that was because of the Voting Rights Act that the South went Democrat. So what is the difference between these two groups? And there is significant difference between being a Republican and a Democrat. A Republican, for the most part, believe in state rights, the right of the state to determine the fate of its people, with minimum federal government interference. The Democrats, which is very appealing to blacks because we've seen what states can do in the South during the periods of segregation, believe in a strong central federal government to protect rights, to ensure rights. That's a fundamental difference. So Republicans, more state control, Democrats, strong central government. The Republicans, less federal regulations, whether it's business, the economy, less federal involvement. Democrats, more federal regulations, more federal oversight to ensure that objectives are being met. The Republicans, less taxes, not only on the individual, but corporations. Republicans, a progressive tax, greater taxing on rich and corporations. And we see that now with the progressive end of the Democratic Party fighting for stronger taxes on the upper class and corporations. Republicans, for the most part, much more aggressive in advocating for strong military spending. The Democrats, more moderate military spending. And we see issues about voting rights, gun control, policing. Big difference between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats support these issues. Republicans, less support for these issues. So those are some of the fundamental differences between being a Democrat and a Republican. And you shouldn't necessarily say I'm a Republican because of one central issue. You have to look at the very philosophy of the party today, which is less government, less regulations, less taxes. And that should be the reason for agreeing to be part of that party. Now, the Republican Party, you have people who are moderates, and they're not so extreme in these policies, versus people who are conservative, and they are much more strict in adhering to these concerns. So in the Republican Party, you have moderates and conservatives. In the Democrat Party, you have moderates, people in the middle with these policies, conservatives who want more control over these policies, Democrat policies, and you have progressives, those who want to push these policies further. So when we see that there is discussion and debate in the Democratic Party, it's usually between moderates, conservatives, and progressives. And that's the issue with the infrastructure human infrastructure plan, that's in Congress now, between the Democrats deciding what should be in the bill and what should not be in the bill. But there are fundamental history between the two parties. So I wanted to give you a sense of the difference when people say I'm Democrat. I can be a Democrat and be conservative. I can be a Democrat and be moderate. I can be a Democrat and be progressive. But a conservative Democrat is much less conservative than a conservative Republican. And this can at times get a little confusing, but it's around how people see the role of government in their life and what is the responsibility of government in providing, if any, a social network. I hope this has been helpful. Thanks for listening and watching.